A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hi there, Herman and Corns. We've done some episodes lately talking about the challenge of getting a strong signal-to-noise ratio in the current conflict with Iran. I've mentioned on several episodes that I personally feel skeptical might be actually an understatement in this case. We're seeing things in the news every day that sound very much like theatre or government posturing. We're talking about Donald Trump announcing that we have given the Iranians exactly this deadline and they've offered to do this in return. And we're reading it on the mainstream news and thinking, are we really just getting a front row seat into geopolitics? Because it doesn't seem like it actually makes any sense that people would be broadcasting their intentions in real time to the world. It's kind of transparently absurd, in fact. And this is what led me into the question of, I don't want to get conspiracy theory material. I simply want to get an objective source of news instead of speculating from talking heads, you know, the guys who come on because they were in the army a while back. And I find those guys are often the worst because they have this built-in credibility and people assume that what they say is accurate, but it's not a safe assumption that someone who had access to classified intelligence 10 years ago still has it today. In fact, if they're really retired, the system's kind of failed if they do. So I like this third area, which I would call the think tanks and the military news sources who really specialize in producing coverage that kind of covers the brass tacks. And these are often staffed by ex-military or ex-intelligence people, but I like the fact that they are transparent about who they are. At least I think so. And that is what we should talk about in today's episode is this group of publications. And I'd like to look at one in particular because they do a lot of work here. It's called the Institute for the Study of War. Some of these do have acronyms and names that sound like they were pulled straight out of a George Orwell novel. It sounds kind of banal almost, but very, very, very agreeable. Now, just to be clear, I'm a huge fan of their work, and I'm not making any accusations or insinuations about them being some kind of a shady prop-up organization at all. If that was it wasn't intended to come across that way, lest it did, but they do a lot of good reporting, and they collaborate with some other organizations called the Institute for the Freedom of Democracy, and there are a couple of other ones. Now, they put out a daily précis about what's going on, and it's the closest thing I found to the vaunted SITREP or situational report format that stands out to me as the gold standard in objective writing, where we say, this happened, this is the source that said it happened, this is their leaning. And then you can kind of make what you want from that information. So Herman and Corn, I didn't know before the Iranian war, because I didn't have reason to. What is this group? Who are the groups like it? We can see there's a lot of think tanks and organizations involved in non-proliferation. I would put the Alma Research Center in Israel in the same category. It produces very detailed analysis of what's happening on the northern front. The Institute for National Security Studies, or INSS, in Israel, and there's another one at the clustered in Herzliya, and there's so many of these that the acronyms are often so similar that it becomes a bit of alphabet soup trying to remember them. But that's the cluster of organizations which I think hopefully scopes it out enough to talk about them. They're often housed at universities and have academic rigor, at least they present that, but there are often these question marks about their motivations and their true non-partisanship, that even as someone staunchly on the pro-Israel side, I will sometimes read what they say and say, that's actually much too pro-Israel for my liking. if I wanted to read Hasbara or Israeli propaganda or public diplomacy, I wouldn't be here. So that is actually a sort of red flag for me, even if it aligns with my own take on the conflict. So Herman and Corin has talked about this cluster of organizations, what it is that they do. What are some reputable ones you might be tuning into for those more strategic updates on what's happening on the ground in Iran and Israel at the moment?
I was scrolling through a news feed this morning, and I realized that if I relied on the major networks for my situational awareness of what is happening in Tehran right now, I would basically be operating on a 30-minute delay with about 10% of the actual data. It is like trying to watch a high-speed car race through a keyhole while the stadium lights are flickering. The lag is not just annoying, it is a strategic liability. If you are trying to understand the escalation between Iran and Israel in real time, the legacy media is essentially giving you a postcard of a house that is already on fire.
It is worse than that, Corn. It is like watching the race through a keyhole while the person describing it to you is still trying to figure out what a spark plug does. The utility gap we are seeing in mainstream reporting right now is not just a lag in time, it is a fundamental failure of expertise. We are in the middle of the Second Iran War, and the traditional newsrooms are still using a 24-hour cycle for a conflict that moves in 24-second increments. They are looking for a narrative arc when they should be looking at telemetry and logistics throughput.
Herman Poppleberry has entered the chat, folks. I can see you have about 6 different map tabs open and a stack of white papers that could probably stop a ballistic missile. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the architecture of this intelligence ecosystem. He wants us to look at the think tanks and specialized military news organizations that are actually doing the heavy lifting while the legacy media is still trying to pronounce the names of the Iranian provinces. Daniel is asking for the who's who of high-fidelity reporting.
Daniel is hitting on something crucial here because, as of late March 2026, the speed of Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion has completely outpaced traditional journalism. We are talking about the Institute for the Study of War, the Alma Research Center, and the Institute for National Security Studies. These are not just places where people sit around and theorize about international relations over expensive coffee. In this conflict, they have become the primary nodes for high-fidelity situational awareness. They are bridging the gap between raw signals, intelligence, and policy-level analysis for the public.
Well, before we dive into the specific groups, let us frame this properly. Most people hear think tank, and they think of a dusty office in Washington, D.C., where people write 500-page books that nobody reads until 5 years after the war is over. But we are talking about a defense intelligence ecosystem. Why do we need these specialists to tell us what is happening in the heart of Tehran? Why can't the guy on the evening news just tell us?
Because the guy on the evening news is a generalist. He knows a little bit about everything and not enough about anything to be useful in a crisis. The defense intelligence ecosystem is built on the synthesis of open source intelligence, or OSINT. These organizations are essentially private intelligence agencies using publicly available data satellite imagery, social media, shipping manifests, and even weather patterns to outperform state actors in terms of public transparency. The shift happened because the volume of data generated by a modern conflict is too massive for a traditional newsroom to process. You need a team of analysts who know the specific tail numbers of IRGC transport planes and the exact range of a Hezbollah precision-guided missile.
It is the difference between academic research and operational level reporting. A traditional news organization is looking for a story or a human interest angle. An organization like the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, is looking at command and control structures. They are looking at the kill chain. When a strike hits a missile production site in Tehran, the legacy media asks how the local residents feel. ISW asks which specific IRGC unit was stationed there, what the logistics throughput of that facility was, and how its destruction affects Iran's ability to retaliate in the Strait of Hormuz.
And we need to understand that these organizations are not just reporting the news, they are providing a framework for understanding it. They are the ones who tell us if a drone strike is a tactical annoyance or a strategic shift. Without them, we are just drowning in a sea of unverified Telegram videos and government propaganda.
It is the difference between vibes and vectors. I remember we touched on this in episode 1537 when we talked about the utility gap. If you are an informed observer, or heaven forbid, someone whose business or security depends on these movements, you cannot afford the vibes approach. So let us start with the big one, the Institute for the Study of War. They have been the gold standard for mapping the Ukraine conflict, but their Iran project has been running for over a decade. What makes their methodology so distinct?
Their secret sauce is the synthesis of OSINT with a very specific military methodology. They collaborate heavily with the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. What I find fascinating is their Iran Update series. They treat the entire Middle East as a single theater of operations, which is the only way to actually understand the axis of resistance. They do not look at a drone strike in Iraq as an isolated incident. They map it back to the IRGC's regional proxy network. Their Iran project has been tracking the IRGC's regional proxy network since 2012. They have a database of commanders, recruitment patterns, and weapon shipments that is probably more comprehensive than what some mid-level government agencies have.
I have seen those maps. They are incredibly granular. They do not just put a red dot on a map and say explosion here. They are identifying specific buildings within a compound. How are they getting that level of detail without having a satellite in orbit or a guy on the ground with a camera?
It is a massive jigsaw puzzle of data. They are scraping Telegram channels, analyzing high-resolution commercial satellite imagery from companies like Maxar or Planet Labs, and cross-referencing social media posts from locals. But the real skill is the human analysis. They have experts who know the difference between a standard military transport truck and one that is specifically modified to carry a Fateh 110 ballistic missile. When they reported on the death of IRGC Navy Commander Rear Admiral Ali Reza Tangsiri in Bandar Abbas yesterday, they were not just repeating a rumor. They were looking at the flight patterns of Israeli aircraft, the specific signatures of the munitions used, and the subsequent communication silence from that specific command node. They use a ground truth verification process that requires multiple independent data points before they confirm a movement.
It is a very technical, almost cold way of looking at war. But for someone trying to understand if the Strait of Hormuz is going to stay closed past President Trump's April 6th deadline, that technicality is everything. Now, contrast that with the Alma Research Center. They seem much more specialized, almost like a boutique intelligence firm.
Alma is a completely different beast. While ISW is looking at the macro-strategic map of the entire region, Alma is focused like a laser on the northern arena. That means Lebanon and Syria. It was founded by Sarit Zahavi, who is a retired IDF intelligence officer. If you want to know what is happening 5 kilometers from the Israeli-Lebanese border, you go to Alma. They specialize in the tactical granularity of Hezbollah. They maintain a literal database on Hezbollah's precision-guided missile, or PGM, infrastructure. They know which civilian houses in southern Lebanon have been converted into missile storage facilities.
You have been following their reports on the Radwan force, right? I remember you mentioned their analysis of the tunnel networks near the Litani River.
Their work on the Litani is the most authoritative I have seen. On March 25th, they released a report analyzing 60 different Hezbollah attack waves. They did not just say Hezbollah is attacking, they broke it down by percentage. 41.7% of those attacks targeted communities within 5 kilometers of the border. They are tracking the specific anti-tank guided missile teams. They know the names of the villages where these launchers are hidden because they have been studying the topography and the local demographics for years. They are the ones who identified the shift in Hezbollah's tactics from harassment to saturation. Strikes.
Is there a risk of bias there, though? I mean, they are based in northern Israel. They are led by a former IDF officer. Does that color their reporting in a way that makes it less objective for an outside observer?
That is the trade-off with specialized intelligence. You get incredible proximity and depth, but you have to understand the lens. Alma is unashamedly focused on the security of Israel's northern border. They are the ones advocating for a security zone up to the Litani River. But here is the thing, their technical data is rarely wrong. When they say Hezbollah has moved a precision-guided missile battery into a specific valley, they usually provide the evidence to back it up. In a high-intensity conflict like the one we are in right now, I would rather have high-fidelity data with a known bias than low-fidelity neutrality that tells me nothing. You account for the bias in your analysis, but you can't account for missing data.
Fair point. It is like choosing between a local guide who really wants you to buy a specific rug but knows exactly where the quicksand is, versus a tourist who has no agenda but is also currently sinking into the quicksand. You take the guide and you just account for the rug pitch.
That is a surprisingly good analogy for someone who usually hates them.
I have my moments. Let us move to the third player, the Institute for National Security Studies, or INSS. They are based in Tel Aviv, affiliated with Tel Aviv University. They feel more academic, or is that just the branding?
They are the big picture thinkers. If ISW is the tactical map and Alma is the ground level scout, INSS is the strategic boardroom. They look at the so what of the war. They are the ones asking how these military strikes translate into political reality. They provide a blend of academic rigor and security policy expertise. They have deep ties to the Israeli defense establishment, but they maintain an independent streak. They are the ones who will criticize the government's long-term strategy even while supporting the immediate military objectives.
I have seen their flash surveys. They seem to be measuring the societal resilience of the Israeli public.
They just released a survey showing that while support for the war remains high at nearly 79%, the public's optimism for a total regime collapse in Iran has dropped significantly in the last 2 weeks. That is an interesting data point. It tells you something about the societal resilience they are always talking about. It is one thing to blow up a missile factory. It is another thing to manage the expectations of a population that has been under rocket fire for a month. INSS shines in providing the context for the escalation. When we saw the strikes in the heart of Tehran today, March 27th, most news outlets were just reporting the explosions. INSS will be the group analyzing how those strikes affect the internal power dynamics of the IRGC now that Khamenei is out of the picture. They are looking at the successor struggle. They are looking at the economic impact of oil hitting $107 a barrel.
So, if I'm trying to build the ultimate second Iran war newsfeed, I am basically looking at a hierarchy of information. I want ISW for the daily tactical updates and the macro map. I want Alma for the granular. Is there a missile pointing at me data on the Lebanese border? And I want INSS to tell me if the whole region is about to fall into a black hole, or if there is a diplomatic off-ramp.
You nailed it, and you have to cross-reference them. If you only read Alma, you might think the entire war is about the Litani River. If you only read ISW, you might get lost in the technical details of drone swarms and forget that there are millions of people whose lives are being upended. But when you put them together, you start to see the actual shape of the conflict.
Let us look at a case study to see how this works in practice. Daniel mentioned the February 2026 drone incursions. That was a chaotic moment where the fog of war was thick enough to cut with a knife. How did these groups handle that differently?
That is a perfect case study. Most mainstream outlets were reporting unidentified drones and explosions near Haifa. They were waiting for an official statement from the IDF or the Pentagon. Alma, however, was the first to identify the specific flight paths coming out of Syria. They were able to correlate the drone types, likely the Shahed 136 variants with known IRGC-controlled airfields in the Homs region. They had the tactical truth within 2 hours.
And what was ISW doing during those same 2 hours?
ISW was mapping the broader context. They were showing how those drone strikes were synchronized with cyber attacks on Israeli power infrastructure and a simultaneous uptick in militia activity in Iraq. They were the ones who pointed out that this wasn't just a strike. It was a multi-domain pressure test of Israel's air defense integration. They saw the strategic intent, while the legacy media was still trying to confirm if a drone had even crashed.
And INSS?
INSS waited about 12 hours and then released a brief on the red line implications. They analyzed how the Israeli cabinet would have to respond to a direct incursion from Syrian territory versus Lebanese territory. They were looking at the escalation ladder. So, within 24 hours, if you followed all three, you knew where the drones came from, why they were launched as part of a larger plan, and what the likely political response would be. If you just watched the news, you knew that something blew up near Haifa.
It makes the talking heads on the evening news look like they're reading from a history book while the history is still being written. But let us talk about the reputation aspect. In an era of deepfakes and rapid-fire propaganda, how do these organizations maintain their credibility? I mean, we are in a war where the Iranian state media is probably claiming they have sunk the entire US Navy every other day.
It comes down to the receipts. These organizations know that their only currency is accuracy. If ISW reports that a specific IRGC commander was killed and he shows up on video 2 days later, their reputation is shattered. So they are incredibly cautious. They use multiple source verification. What I find wild is that they often use the enemy's own propaganda against them. They will take a video released by a pro-Hezbollah Telegram channel, geolocate the specific trees and buildings in the background, and use that to prove where the launch site actually was. They are essentially using the IRGC's own social media teams as unpaid intelligence scouts.
It is the ultimate gotcha moment. You think you are showing off your new missile, but you actually just gave away the coordinates of your secret base. But Herman, I want to poke at the echo chamber risk. If you are only reading these high-fidelity, defense-oriented reports, do you lose sight of the humanitarian or political nuances? Is there a danger of becoming too clinical about the fact that 1,900 people have died in Iran since February 28th?
There is a real risk of that. When you look at war through a satellite lens, people become pixels. You start talking about attrition rates and logistics nodes instead of human lives. That is why you have to supplement this with other reporting. But here is my counter-argument, Korn. In a conflict this intense, the most humanitarian thing you can have is accurate information. If you know that a specific neighborhood in southern Lebanon is being used as a Radwan Force staging area because Alma mapped it, that is information that saves lives. It allows for targeted warnings and evacuations. The clinical nature of the reporting is a feature, not a bug. It removes the emotional manipulation that legacy media often uses to fill the gaps in their actual knowledge.
I see what you mean. It is like a surgeon. You do not want the surgeon crying over you while they are operating. You want them to be clinical, precise, and focused on the data. The empathy comes in the form of doing the job correctly. But what about the feedback loop? How much do these organizations actually influence the people making the decisions?
More than you might think. We're seeing a very specific feedback loop between these think tanks and policymakers. I can almost guarantee you that the briefs landing on President Trump's desk or the Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz's desk are built on the same OSINT foundations that ISW and Alma are using. Sometimes, the think tanks are actually faster than the classified agencies because they don't have to go through the same bureaucratic declassification hurdles to share information. The gap between classified intelligence and open source intelligence has never been smaller. In some cases, the open source guys are leading the way.
That is a staggering thought. That a well-read civilian with an internet connection and a subscription to these reports can have a situational awareness that rivals a junior intelligence officer from 20 years ago. It is democratized intelligence. But it requires a lot of work. You cannot just consume this information, you have to process it.
You have to understand what a security zone up to the Litani actually implies for regional stability. You have to understand why the death of a supreme leader like Khamenei creates a power vacuum that a drone strike can't just fill. You have to be an active participant in your own situational awareness.
Which brings us back to Daniel's question about which ones are the most reputable. It sounds like you are saying they are all reputable, but for different things. If you want the ground-level tactical truth of the Northern Front, it is Alma. If you want the macro-strategic mapping of the entire axis of resistance, it is ISW. And if you want the high-level policy and societal impact, it is INSS.
I would add one more layer to that. Reputation is also about the ability to admit when they are wrong. I have seen ISW issue corrections when new satellite data contradicts an earlier assessment. That is how you know they are serious. They are not trying to win an argument. They are trying to map reality. And they are transparent about their methodology. They tell you exactly how they reached a conclusion. That transparency is the antidote to the fake news era.
So, for our listeners who are feeling overwhelmed by the news cycle, what is the practical takeaway here? How do they actually use this information without spending 8 hours a day reading white papers? Because I know you do that, Herman. But most of us have lives. We have jobs, we have families, we have hobbies that don't involve tracking Iranian centrifuge movements.
I feel attacked, but I will allow it. The practical tip is to curate your feed. Do not just follow the news. Follow the specific analysts. Get on the mailing list for the ISW Iran update. It is a daily brief that takes 5 minutes to read but gives you more signal than an hour of cable news. Follow Sarit Zahavi on social media for the Northern Front updates. Set up alerts for the INSS flash surveys. You don't have to read the 500-page books, you just have to read the executive summaries and look at the maps.
And maybe check out some of our past episodes, like 1117, where we did a situational report right as the conflict was escalating in mid-March. It helps to see how these predictions actually play out. It is like looking at the weather forecast from last week to see if the meteorologist actually knows what they are talking about.
That is actually a great way to test these organizations. Go back and read what Alma was saying about Hezbollah's anti-tank missile capabilities in January 2026 before the war started. Then look at what happened in March. You will see that they were shouting from the rooftops about the specific infrastructure that the IDF is now having to dismantle. Their reputation was built long before the first shots were fired. They were the Cassandras of the northern arena.
It is a bit grim though, isn't it? Being right about a war that kills thousands of people.
It is the burden of the Cassandra. You see it coming, you map it out, and then you watch it happen. But being right means you can prepare. It means you can predict where the next strike might be. When Israel launched that new wave of strikes in Tehran today, it was not a surprise to anyone who had been reading the ISW reports on the ballistic missile production sites. The targets were already highlighted in red on their maps weeks ago.
Speaking of those strikes, the detail about the ballistic missile sites is key. They aren't just hitting random buildings, they are hitting the specific nodes that allow Iran to threaten the global economy via the Strait of Hormuz. That is a direct line from intelligence to strategy.
And that is why the oil prices are reacting the way they are. Brent crude at $107 is a reflection of the market's intelligence. The market knows that if those missile sites are destroyed, Iran's leverage over the strait decreases, but the short-term risk of a scorched earth retaliation increases. The traders are reading the same reports we are. They are looking at the same satellite imagery of the Bandar Abbas port.
I wonder if AI is going to change this. We talk about these human-centric think tanks, but with the way things are going, will we just have an AI analyst scraping Telegram and generating these maps in real time? I mean, we are sitting here in 2026, and the speed of data is already hitting a human limit.
We are already seeing it. Some of the mapping tools ISW uses are augmented by AI to identify changes in terrain or vehicle movements between satellite passes. It is called change detection. But you still need the human, so what? An AI can tell you that 10 trucks move from point A to point B. It takes an expert like the ones at Alma to tell you that those trucks are carrying specific guidance kits for Hezbollah's rockets, and that this move indicates an offensive is planned for the next 48 hours. The future of OSINT is this hybrid model, man-machine teaming.
So the nerds are safe for now. Your job is secure, Herman.
I am glad one of us is worried about my career prospects. But seriously, the organizations that can blend high-speed data processing with deep regional expertise are the ones that will bridge the utility gap. The human element is the context engine. Without it, data is just noise.
It is fascinating to think that we are living through the first truly transparent, high-intensity war. Not because the governments want it to be transparent. They are still trying to hide as much as possible, but because they can't hide it anymore. Between the satellites, the smartphones, and the think tanks, the shadow war has been dragged into the light.
And that is a good thing for the informed citizen. It means we don't have to wait for a declassified report 10 years from now to understand why the strikes in Tehran happened today. We can see the why in real time. We can see the IRGC's logistics chains breaking. We can see the shift in Hezbollah's defensive posture. It is a level of insight that was previously reserved for the highest levels of government.
Well, I think we have given Daniel a pretty comprehensive look at the landscape. It is ISW for the big map, Alma for the northern border, and INSS for the strategic so what. And most importantly, keep your eyes on the data, not the drama. The drama is what the legacy media sells to get clicks. The data is what helps you understand if the world is going to look different tomorrow morning.
The drama is for the legacy media. The data is for the people who actually want to understand the world. Intelligence is a process, not a product. You have to keep updating your mental map as the situation on the ground shifts.
Spoken like a true donkey. This has been a deep dive into the brain trust of the Second Iran War. I feel like I need to go look at a map now just to keep up with you. Herman, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Just that we are entering a new era of accountability. When these think tanks map out a missile site in a civilian area, it puts pressure on both sides. It pressures the IRGC to move it, and it pressures the IDF to be precise. Transparency is a double-edged sword, but in the long run, it is the only thing that keeps the narrative grounded in reality.
I will take reality over the alternative any day. All right, let us wrap this up. We have covered a lot of ground today, from the tactical granularity of the Alma Research Center to the strategic depth of INSS and the macro mapping of ISW. The utility gap is real, but the tools to bridge it are right there if you are willing to look past the mainstream headlines.
Just remember to cross-reference. Never rely on a single source, no matter how reputable they are.
And it is shifting fast. April 6th is coming up, and that Strait of Hormuz deadline is going to be a major inflection point. We will be watching those ISW updates closely.
As always,
Big thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes while we dive into these rabbit holes. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We literally couldn't do this without that technical backbone. It is the infrastructure that makes the insight possible.
we appreciate the support.
If you found this episode helpful in navigating the current chaos, do us a favor and leave a review on your podcast app. It actually helps more than you think in terms of getting this kind of specialized analysis in front of more people who are tired of the vibes-based reporting.
Every review helps.
You can find all our past episodes, including the situational reports from earlier this month, at myweirdprompts.com. We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified. The second a new episode drops, just search for My Weird Prompts. We post links to the specific reports Herman mentioned there as well.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
Stay informed, stay skeptical, and we will talk to you in the next one. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and